everyone, welcome back to Daily Easy English Talk. I'm Emma.
And I'm Jack. Thanks for joining us.
We've got quite a collection of reports here today. ABC News, CBC, CNN, Fox News, all focused on, well, a really major event. Israel's significant strikes inside Iran early Friday morning, June 13th, 2025.
That's right. And these aren't just brief news flashes. If you look at them together, they really start to paint a picture of a serious escalation. And they hint at a lot happening maybe beneath the surface, too.
So our mission today for you listening is to sift through all this material. We want to pull out the key pieces, the really crucial nuggets of information from these different reports.
Yeah, exactly. So you can get a quick handle on what actually happened, what the sources, the thinking was behind it, the immediate fallout, the reactions, and maybe, just maybe, get a sense of what might be coming next based on the analysis in these reports.
Okay, let's start with the basics then. What happened? These reports describe something pretty massive, operationally speaking.
Israel launching, it sounds like, dozens of strikes right across Iran. One IDF official, that's the Israel Defense Forces, is quoted talking about around 200 jets.
200 jets.
Yeah. Flying this incredibly long round trip, like 2,000 miles deep into Iran. And this is important. According to that same source, the aerial part, at least, went off without any reported Israeli issues or casualties.
That's quite a claim for such a complex mission. And the targets, what did they hit, according to these sources?
Well, the reports are pretty consistent here. They point to really core parts of Iran's nuclear program being struck. There's mention of major damage at the main enrichment facility, Natanz,
right. That's the big one, the underground one.
Exactly. The sources emphasize that it's not just a building. It's this, heavily fortified underground complex. And hitting Natanz is significant because, well, that's where Iran does most of its uranium enrichment. It's central to any potential path towards a weapon, which Israel obviously sees as a major threat.
So a direct hit on the nuclear program's heart, from Israel's perspective, as presented here. What else did the reports say was targeted?
Well, beyond the nuclear side, extensive hits on military sites, too. Facilities that produce ballistic missiles, for example, and also parts of Iran's existing missile arsenal.
And there's a really grim aspect highlighted in some of these reports. They talk about specific people being killed.
Yes, that's a major point in several sources. They indicate that both nuclear scientists and, very significantly, really high-ranking military leaders were killed.
Do they name names?
They do. General Hossein Salami is mentioned. He's the commander-in-chief of the Revolutionary Guard. And also Major General Mohammad Bagheri, who's described in these reports as Iran's basically highest-ranking military officer.
Wow. So top leadership, how did that happen? Do the sources give details?
The accounts vary a little bit. Some reports mention scientists being targeted, maybe killed at their homes. Others suggest the top military figures might have been hit together, possibly in an underground bunker during some kind of meeting or coordination effort.
And air defenses, were they targeted too?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Air defense systems across Iran were explicitly mentioned as targets.
Yeah.
And according to the Israeli accounts reported here, they were successfully degraded or taken out.
Okay, so let's piece this together. Nuclear sites, missile factories, top military and scientific figures, air defenses. What was the overall goal here? The operation had a code name, right? Operation Rising Lion.
Yes, Rising Lion. And according to the Israeli statements reported in these sources, the goals were, well, ambitious and very starkly put. Basically to destroy Iran's nuclear capability and its missile arsenal, full stop.
Destroy, not just damage.
The language used, particularly from Prime Minister Netanyahu, quoted in one source, is about preventing Iran from ever getting an atomic bomb, preventing what he called a potential nuclear holocaust. So the stated aim seems to be dismantlement, a fundamental rollback of the threat as they see it.
That's huge. And was this presented as a single decisive strike, or is there more to come?
Good question. One IDF official cited suggests this might just be the beginning. The quote was something like, the attacks could last days or even weeks, to get the job done.
Days or weeks. Wow.
And Israel is also claiming, in these reports, that they had achieved complete control of Iranian airspace during the operation. They suggest that previous actions had already sort of softened up Iran's air defenses, maybe taken out missiles that were ready to launch.
And they called up reservists beforehand.
Yes. The sources mentioned a deployment of reservists prior to the strikes, which definitely points towards this being a pre-planned, probably multi-stage operation, not just a reactive hit.
Okay, so that's the Israeli side of the story as reported. What about Iran's immediate reaction? Because you mentioned earlier the accounts seem to differ quite a bit here.
They really do. So
Yeah.
Israel reported that Iran fired back immediately with about 100 drones. But Israel also claimed they shot all those down before they even reached Israeli airspace.
Okay, 100 drones intercepted.
But then you look at Iran's Fars news agency, cited in another report, and they flatly deny it. They say no drones were launched from Iran at all.
Right, so a total contradiction there. It really shows how hard it is to know exactly what's happening in real time.
Absolutely. It highlights why looking at multiple sources, even conflicting ones, is so important. You have to see the different narratives being put out there.
So what do the Iranian sources quoted in these reports actually confirm?
They do confirm that Israeli attacks were happening and hitting multiple cities, not just isolated military targets, but places like Tehran, Karaj, Fardiz, and also the Hamadan Air Base.
So widespread impact acknowledged.
Yes. And Iranian state media confirmed their air defenses were active. They specifically reported shooting down at least one drone near the Fordo nuclear facility. That's another key enrichment site.
And there was also something about a missile from Yemen.
Right. Separate from the direct Iran-Israel exchange, the Israeli military reported intercepting a missile that was launched from Yemen, where Iran obviously has allies and influence heading towards Israel.
Okay. And the official Iranian response, the diplomatic or political reaction.
Very strong language. Iran's foreign minister, according to these sources, called the strikes nothing less than a declaration of war. He used terms like reckless aggression, brazen and unlawful act.
Strong words. Any threats?
Oh, yes. A clear warning that Israel would deeply regret it. And he stated very clearly that Iran reserves the right to respond decisively and proportionately.
And they involved the U.S. diplomatically.
They did. They reportedly summoned the Swiss ambassador in Tehran. Switzerland often handles U.S. interests there since they don't have direct diplomatic ties. The message, according to the reports, was a direct warning to the U.S., accusing Washington of complicity in the strikes.
That's complicity. That's a serious charge.
And warning the U.S. basically not to get involved or support Israel if or perhaps when Iran retaliates.
Okay, so that's the overt layer. The
Yeah.
strikes, the targets, the immediate back-and-forth claims. But you mentioned something else. These reports, particularly some from U.S. outlets, hint at a whole other dimension, an intelligence operation.
Exactly. This is where the story gets, well, even more complex and, frankly, quite astonishing. Several sources describe this entire operation not just as airstrikes, but as the culmination of years of incredibly detailed covert work.
Years. What kind of work?
We're talking deep surveillance, meticulous planning, and significant infiltration inside Iran, primarily attributed to Israel's Mossad intelligence agency.
Mossad, so spies on the ground.
It sounds like it went far beyond just passive intelligence gathering. The reports describe unprecedented coordination. One source uses the phrase shoulder to shoulder between the Israeli Air Force, their military intelligence directorate, Mossad, and even Israeli defense companies. It implies this whole thing was built on a foundation of really deep intelligence.
And the scale of this infiltration, what did the sources say?
The descriptions are pretty dramatic. Sources claim Mossad was working with a huge number of people, a mass of agents deep inside Iran. One report goes so far as to call it the highest level of penetration imaginable.
Highest level imaginable. That's incredible.
And get this, some of these agents inside Iran were apparently retrained specifically as commando fighters for roles in this operation.
Wow. So not just intel gathering, but active operational roles. Do they give examples of these covert tactics?
They do, and some of them sound almost unbelievable. For instance, one report mentions establishing a drone base inside Iran itself ahead of time, then retrieving those drones from hidden locations and activating them precisely when the main air attack began.
A drone base inside Iran. How?
The reports don't detail the how, but the implication is long-term embedding of assets. Another tactic mentioned is placing precision missiles on vehicles inside Iran, and even embedding other missiles in unexpected places throughout the country. The report literally says hidden inside rocks, all designed to be activated remotely in sync with the airstrikes.
Hidden in rocks. That sounds like something from a spy thriller.
It really does. They also mention using disguised vehicles to take out Iranian air defense systems before the main wave of jets arrived, clearing the path, and activating explosive drums that were apparently pre-positioned near Tehran, specifically to target long-range missile launchers.
This paints a picture of incredibly detailed, pre-planned sabotage and attacks from within, timed perfectly with the external assault.
Exactly. And the sources point to one specific, major intelligence success. They reportedly knew exactly where Iran's Air Force Command Center was located, and that top commanders were gathered there for a known military drill. And they managed to target and hit that command center in real time during the strikes.
Taking out the command structure while it was active.
Yeah. One official quoted called it an insane level of intelligence work, admitting it was partly luck maybe, but also the result of meticulous planning and precision timing.
Some reports compare this to the Pagers operation Israel ran in Lebanon against Hezbollah a while back. Is that a fair comparison based on these sources?
The comparison is made, yeah. But these sources are quick to say this Iran operation was far more substantial. The pager incident was mainly about communications infiltration. This, according to the reports, involved years of building actual physical infrastructure, electronic surveillance networks, and operational cells deep inside Iran.
So a much deeper, longer-term, more embedded operation.
That's the picture painted. The analysis in these reports frames it as possibly one of Israel's most successful integrations ever of deep intelligence work and military strike capability. And the message Israel seems to be sending, loud and clear according to this analysis.
That nowhere is safe.
Pretty much. Nowhere inside Iran is out of reach.
And crucially, the reports emphasize that these specific covert actions, the drones from inside, the hidden missiles, the targeting of the command center, they all apparently happen without being detected beforehand by Iranian intelligence or security services.
That adds a whole different layer to understanding the impact and the potential Iranian response. It wasn't just an air attack they couldn't stop. It involved deep internal breaches. Precisely. Which brings us to the ripple effects. What happens now? What are the wider reactions? And what do these reports suggest might come next?
Well, we already heard Iran's official condemnation and threat to retaliate decisively. What do the experts cited in these sources think will actually happen?
The consensus among analysts quoted across these reports seems pretty clear. Iran will likely retaliate. There's a sense that they almost have to respond.
Bye.
To restore deterrence, basically. After what some sources are calling a profound strategic humiliation, not just the strikes, but the apparent intelligence failures revealed, Iran needs to show it can still strike back effectively to save face and reestablish boundaries.
So retaliation is expected. What form might it take? Big missile barrages?
That's definitely on the table. Experts suggest potential large-scale drone or missile strikes, possibly even larger or more sophisticated than previous exchanges we've seen.
But you mentioned a dilemma for Iran earlier.
Right. They face this tough choice. They need to respond forcefully enough to restore their credibility, but doing so could provoke even more devastating Israeli attacks, especially given the capabilities Israel just demonstrated, including those covert ones.
So they risk further escalation if they hit back too hard.
Exactly. So some experts cited suggest the response might be calculated, maybe delayed, maybe broken up into different phases. It could range from conventional ballistic missiles aimed at Israeli targets to potentially activating proxy groups for attacks, maybe even including terror attacks on softer targets internationally. That's mentioned as a possibility.
That sounds incredibly destabilizing. Some sources used a phrase.
Yeah, the Rubicon has been crossed. That phrase appears in a couple of analyses suggesting that this event has fundamentally changed the game and makes a much larger escalation, maybe even regional war, significantly more likely than before.
Okay, which inevitably brings the United States into the picture.
Okay.
What role did the U.S. play or know about, according to these various reports? Because this seems complicated.
It really does. The sources here present a genuinely complex and sometimes, frankly, contradictory picture. It's hard to get a single, clear answer from this collection of reports.
Okay, let's walk through the different accounts presented. What's one version?
One source flat out states the U.S. provided exquisite intelligence to Israel before the strikes. That implies significant assistance.
Exquisite intelligence. Okay, but then
you have a U.S. official talking to ABC News who says very clearly the U.S. had no assistance or involvement in the strike itself. A direct contradiction.
No assistance or involvement. All right. What about the view from Israel, as reported?
Well, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu is quoted stating that Israel coordinated with the U.S. in advance, and specifically mentioned that the Trump administration knew about the strike.
Knew about it, coordinated in advance, and President Trump himself commented.
He did. He spoke to Reuters and NBC, saying the U.S. of course supports Israel. He said the U.S. knew everything that was going on. He even clarified it wasn't just a heads up, but we know what's going on. And he called the Israeli operation very successful.
So Trump claims full awareness and support, but didn't Secretary of State Rubio say something different just before?
Yes, that adds another layer of, well, confusion perhaps.
Yeah.
Secretary of State Marco Rubio, In a statement just the day before the strikes on Thursday, it was also quoted saying there was no U.S. involvement or assistance.
Okay, so we have U.S. provided exquisite intel. U.S. had no involvement. Israel coordinated with U.S. and Trump knew. Trump says U.S. knew everything and supports it. And the Secretary of State says no U.S. involvement.
Exactly. So reading across these sources, you just don't get a consistent story on the precise nature or level of U.S. awareness or participation before or during the strikes. We have to just present these different accounts as they are reported.
It really highlights the challenge. We should also mention, one source notes the U.S. State Department did form a task force before the strikes happened, but describes this as sort of standard procedure during times of heightened security concern.
Right, a potentially precautionary measure, regardless of direct involvement in this specific operation.
What does all this mean for diplomacy? There were supposed to be U.S.-Iran nuclear talks, weren't there?
Yes, talks planned in Oman, reportedly for this weekend. The consensus in these reports is that those are now highly unlikely to happen.
Makes sense.
Yeah. Interestingly, Iraq has apparently urged Iran to still go ahead with the talks. But the analysis in one source suggests this attack isn't likely to suddenly make Iran more willing to negotiate. If anything, it might harden positions and, push further towards escalation rather than diplomacy.
Okay, let's zoom out even further. How are these events being framed in the wider context of the Middle East?
Some sources connect this directly to Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu's maybe long-term strategic goals, seeing it as part of a broader plan to reshape the regional power balance, fundamentally weakening Iran.
Is there analysis suggesting why now?
Yes, some analysis points to recent Israeli successes against Iranian proxies, like Hezbollah in Lebanon. The idea presented is that these successes might have weakened Iran's overall position, creating what Israel perceived as a strategic window of opportunity for a more direct major strike like this one.
A window of opportunity. But others see it differently.
Definitely. As we mentioned, some reports and analysts quoted describe this as potentially opening Pandora's box, a high-risk move that could unleash much wider conflict and instability across the entire region, which is already incredibly tense.
What about other international reactions beyond Iran and the U.S.?
We're seeing reports of calls for de-escalation, urging restraint and diplomatic solutions. Countries like the UK, France, Germany are mentioned. They're also generally reaffirming Israel's right to self-defense, but the main message seems to be urging calm.
Anyone condemning the strikes?
Iraq, for one. They've reportedly condemned the strikes, and they've even filed a formal complaint with the UN Security Council.
And are there any immediate practical consequences being reported?
A few are mentioned. Israel apparently closed some of its foreign embassies, likely as a security precaution against potential retaliation, and Delta Airlines, for example, canceled its flights to Tel Aviv, reportedly through August. So real-world impacts are already visible.
There's also some analysis touching on international law.
Yeah, a point raised in one analysis is that actions like these, especially if they involve extensive covert operations inside another country's territory without consent, could be seen by some as challenging the established rules and norms of international law, pushing things towards a more might makes right or law of the jungle scenario in international relations.
And of course, within the U.S., different politicians are reacting differently, as you'd expect, and that's reflected across these various news sources, too.
Absolutely. A whole spectrum of reactions domestically in the U.S. is also part of the picture these reports provide.
So let's bring this back to you, listening to this. Why does untangling all this matter? Why is it important to understand this complex, fast-moving situation?
Well, because fundamentally, events of this scale, in such a critical part of the world, they don't happen in a vacuum. They have potentially huge global implications.
Like what?
Regional stability, obviously. International relations between major powers, the U.S., Iran, Israel, but also Russia, China, European countries. And as we saw with the flight cancellations, there can be direct, tangible impacts on things like global travel, energy markets, the economy. It ripples outwards.
And doing this deep dive, looking at all these different sources together, really drives home a crucial point, doesn't it?
It really does. It shows you the messy reality of trying to understand major international events as they unfold. You see different perspectives, you encounter conflicting information, you realize there's uncertainty.
Yeah, it really underscores how important it is to, consume information critically, to look at different angles, and to be comfortable with the fact that sometimes, especially early on, you won't have all the answers or a perfectly clear picture.
Exactly. You have to weigh the evidence presented, consider the source, and piece together the most likely scenario while acknowledging the gaps and contradictions.
Okay, so just to recap briefly, we've covered the really significant Israeli military strikes inside Iran. We've looked at that reported incredibly sophisticated layer of covert intelligence operations that apparently paved the way. We've seen the strong reactions, the threats from Iran, the potential for major escalation.
We've also navigated the, let's call it, murky picture of U.S. involvement or foreknowledge presented differently across the sources. And we've touched on the wider context and the very uncertain path ahead for the region based on the analysis we have right now.
It's definitely a situation where the dust hasn't settled and the full consequences are yet to be seen. These reports give us a vital, though still developing, snapshot. And that leaves us and you with a pretty significant question to think about, drawing directly from what we've discussed from these sources. Considering that unprecedented level of covert activity described the spies, the commandos, the drones launched from inside, the pre-positioned hidden weapons, the real-time targeting deep within Iran, how might this specific type of warfare, this blend of deep intelligence penetration and military strikes, how might it fundamentally change the way future conflicts are fought? Not just between Israel and Iran, but potentially anywhere.
That's a heavy question. How does this kind of shadow war change the rules of the game?
Exactly. Something to definitely mull over after hearing the details presented in these reports today.
So don't forget to subscribe to Daily Easy English Talk so you don't miss our next show.
Yeah, please do, and share it with your friends if you found it helpful.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Bye-bye.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Daily Easy English Talk. I'm Emma.
And I'm Jack. Thanks for joining us.